Nature Conservancy provided, which was a really great presentation that is recorded and up on Slack, as is Dagmar Llewellyn's presentation that provides a nice overview of the Rio Grande watershed as a socio-ecological system. And so we were just getting to that Q&A when we got crashed. And so kind of where we're headed, let me just actually share my screen now. Where we're going to be headed today is going to be sort of a review of in some respects some of the information that we've discussed potentially as over those pieces, probably more in the small groups, including maybe some follow-up questions that people might have, or clarifying questions for Colin based on the Rio Grande Water Fund. There's going to be more time when we get together as a team to do that work, of course. But today the real focus is going to be on what does it really mean to engage in this thing called transdisciplinary research. Now, is that just a new buzzword that's sort of out there that people are using because it sounds cooler and more ambitious than interdisciplinary, which is what we all used to be doing allegedly as research? Or is it truly something that is different qualitatively and structurally and otherwise different as an approach from other types of research? I'm going to argue that it actually is when it's done right. And in order to do that, we're going to be actually having most of this as a breakout group discussion, and we're going to be having it as then a larger conversation we pull back together from our breakout. So I'm going to be providing just sort of a brief kind of overview where we've been and a little bit about this concept of transdisciplinary research. And then we're going to be moving into breakouts to talk about what that means for this watershed and what that would potentially look like, and talking about the paper, talking about ideas, trajectories for research, and then coming back together as a larger group. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions at this point about where we might be headed from anyone? All right, let's move. So at its basis, transdisciplinary research is characteristically a little bit different from interdisciplinary research in two ways. Both involve teams from different disciplines or different kind of backgrounds, different types of expertise within academia, but you can engage in interdisciplinary research and still be very oriented in the ivory tower and be very much looking at an abstract concept. Whereas transdisciplinary research starts with a quote unquote real world problem. Although what I meant to do, I guess maybe I didn't save that when I closed it, is to strike out problem and instead put challenge, because I prefer challenges to problems. As a way of thinking about what we're taking on. So a real world challenge. And the research questions and the design about how you approach them is actually something that is co-created in place where the research is actually taking place. So with the stakeholders that are involved and with the communities that are involved, and those are not always the same thing. So that is a characteristic of it. It's also, oh my gosh, this is the wrong PowerPoint. That's why this looks different. Hold on. Maybe not. No, it's all right. All right. Okay, I guess I just had two different things here. All right. So, so in the context of our watershed, what we're going to be looking at with the Rio Grande, of course, is this idea of thinking about what that means in the context of the upper watershed. Last webinar, we talked about the ways in which we have a watershed that is, and this is part of Dagmar's talk as well, that is crossing an ecological tipping point. It is in the process of regime change. The forest systems that existed in the past are no longer going to be existing in the future. What that's going to mean for water supply, what that's going to mean for the communities themselves is very much in a question. And what was being done right now from a water supply standpoint very directly is an aggressive biofuel removal and watershed restoration program over about a total of 600,000 acres. So there are a lot of interesting questions related to the fund itself and its approach, and maybe beyond the fund related to that. One of the interesting things also related to transdisciplinary research is that the concept of transdisciplinary research really has co-evolved with the notion of sustainable development and sustainability science as a model, in part because of the recognition that to take on the kinds of challenges like a watershed crossing an ecological threshold and the types of economic, social, and hydrological and other kinds of questions that are going to be brought on by that, you need to have a very a really complex team to take on that complex challenge to solve that quote unquote problem. So, and this is my last slide before we really kind of break into groups or I take kind of quick questions and throw us into conversation, is that transdisciplinary research would involve us reflecting on, who do we potentially have at the table as a team? And I often say UNM, but I don't want to necessarily limit that to UNM. We actually have people on the call who are interested in participating in this project that are not necessarily at UNM as an institution. I think we want to have that be the home of the institution, but not necessarily limit it to UNM researchers per se. But definitely, if we think of at this point, and we also have on the call people that are potentially quote unquote on the stakeholder or community side of this call, like Diane Agnew from the Water Utility Authority and Colin from the Rio Grande Water Fund Nature Conservancy. So I like the fact that we've got a mix already kind of started in here. So, but I think part of the orientation for this call really is from a researcher's perspective, what is there to be offered, but recognizing that there's a co-design in the research questions themselves. There's a co-production of knowledge when it comes to transdisciplinary research. And this is very much a difference from many traditional academic perspectives. So sort of viewing that knowledge is something that is maybe handed down from academia or transmitted, as a scientific product to a community, rather than something that is created with a community. Also recognizing that there's knowledge in communities and from stakeholders that can be gleaned and shared. And in this case, that means everything from traditional ecological knowledge from Native communities that are living in the area to incredibly sophisticated stakeholders like Dagmar Llewellyn and her basin study that she's going to be conducting in the area. Data that's being gathered by the Water Utility Authority on water use, or that Colin has maybe already contracted out from other scientists. So there's a variety of different ways in which that knowledge could be produced and recognized. But this last piece I'm noting, this idea of honoring other ontologies is a piece that I'm particularly interested in. And I've got our Zia symbol up here, because I think particularly here in New Mexico, where we have many different living communities who come from very different kinds of backgrounds and have different ways of knowing and experiencing reality, different histories that embed and inform that reality. We have an opportunity to see landscapes and landscape management really differently. We do see it differently. We honor it differently in how we protect acequia communities, for example, and other characteristics that are unique to our state. And I think that many of us were really very intrigued by the ways in which the Rio Grande Fund is modeling its forest councils around the acequia traditions, for example, that there are some ways in which we've built ways of learning and knowing here that can be very very interesting and also worth honoring. And this element of what we could build into models and conceptual models of ways about thinking about doing research is something that transdisciplinarity really allows for. So the next webinar is actually going to be looking at a type of transdisciplinary research that really specifically gets to this element more specifically. And as the reading for today discussed, there are really kind of two different schools of thought with regard to transdisciplinary research. One's called like Mode 2, and the other one's called like the Nicholasolians. I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically a more of a creating a new research methodology, and that one is going to be explored next time with an article by Tati Steelman and some colleagues that did research with Indigenous communities up in Canada. So that's that article. Today's article is more of the Mode 2 research, the one that views transdisciplinary more as a research method. And so that's just sort of my super short pitch about what transdisciplinary research is and how it's maybe a little different than traditional interdisciplinary research. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see beautiful faces and you can see each other's faces and take any questions before we talk about moving people into some groups for some discussion. So thoughts, responses, questions?
I had a thought about this. This is something that I've looked at a little bit in the past year or so through the book Designs for the Pluriverse by Arturo Escobar. I'm sure a bunch of you have read that book. But what's really interesting in it is he talks about the transition design framework that comes out of Carnegie Mellon. And I just want to offer this. It's a PDF that I'll put in the chat, but I think it has a pretty cool, if I can share my screen. I know how to do this. If you look here, you can see it just very fundamentally talks about the same ideas, including the term wicked problems, which I think is a really powerful way to sort of talk about these challenges that you mentioned. But what's really nice is as you get further into it, and I'm just going to scroll down to the diagrams. They've got some really nice diagrams about how we rethink the frameworks for these types of collaborations, you know, thinking about design approaches and situating oneself. And then also, well, this one's kind of sideways, so it's hard to see, but this idea of interactions and who are we working with or who are we working for and who do we think we are? So it's pretty useful. I'll put it in the chat just so everyone can check it out, because it might be something worth looking at in more detail later.
Thank you so much. That's great. I appreciate that. And I think graphics can be really helpful. I actually ended up pulling.
Can we put that on the Slack site as well?
For sure.
Yeah, sure.
Definitely, definitely. I was looking for good graphics too, and ended up. I've got one I'll share a little bit later too, because I think those can be really helpful. Um, other thoughts before we break out and into groups? My thought is that we could break out into groups and maybe just kind of kick around some ideas regarding what this would look like, in the watershed, with given what we've now learned from Dagmar and Colin, and what we bring with our own knowledge, and then come back and talk as a larger group. We could talk for about 20 minutes and in small groups, and come back and talk for another 20 minutes as a larger group. How does that sound to people? Awesome.
Can I raise one
Please.
request? Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie Stansbury. There's a lot going on, especially in state and local government and philanthropy around the Rio Grande, and building a program around how do we address these big structural shortages that we're facing right now and in the upcoming year. And so I think it would be really awesome if the academic community would be willing to consider aligning their research program around some of the things that we really need out in the world. And I think that's what you're saying in terms of co-production. But especially, in the next couple of years, there's likely to be a big program built around, especially philanthropic investments in the NGO sector, and trying to do governance reform. So it'd be great to seed the conversation with some of that as well.
Thank you, Melanie. Yeah, I think, as I said, maybe on one of the first webinars that we did, in my dream scenario for this collaborative, we have an ongoing network where we almost have a site location where we're ongoing percolation of work we're all ongoing doing together, but we also have maybe some sort of a site or something where we have kind of an ongoing understanding of what people are working on, and an ongoing list and understanding of what's needed in the community. But we also have some sort of well-identified kind of suite of skill sets, who's doing what and what people are working on. And so we can match people up, as needed, related to expertise and things like that. Because I think you're absolutely right. We want to be very responsive, and we want people to be able to quickly sort of identify, who has the capacity, where the capacity is, and how we can match people quickly with each other, to be responsive to needs. So I think that that's definitely an element of what we want to be doing, is having almost like a site of faculty capacity or research capacities.
I think that would be amazing. Also, just for everyone's information, that in state government, at least, over and over again, I see one or two people get called over and over again to be experts to testify. And a lot of you all, who I think of as my go-tos as experts in rivers and river issues, kind of aren't in that milieu. And so I think having that way to communicate where your expertise is also super helpful to help bring you guys more into the public role as well. So I think that would be great.
Great. So Irene, we've got 23 people. So I'm thinking maybe 4 groups, and then we may end up moving 1 or 2 people around to spread a few people out if necessary. But I know how to do that. I've been doing that in my classroom. So let's just do a random scatter shot, but then we might end up moving 1 or 2 people around in groups if necessary. Does that make sense?
Okay. And 20 minutes, you said too?
I think that, yeah, let's start with 15. Since we talked for a little bit more, let's do 15, because I want to make sure we've got time for as a large group. So let's start with 15.
Okay.
Do that.
There will be a 60-second countdown, but I'll do a 5-minute reminder too.
Okay, great.
All right, here we go.
See you soon. Have fun. Talk a lot. Bye. I just said I just got sucked out of a break room, which I do to my students all the time. I've never experienced it myself.
It's very abrupt.
We concluded 15 minutes was really fast by the time we got through our
I know, right? But the good news is that we have 15 minutes still left to share with each other as a large group. So we just ended up on a one really good conversation, question that I wanted to extend to the larger group that Dina from the College of Education was asking of our small group, which was, does anyone on this call have any experience with doing this before? And then, so I was sharing a little bit of the work that Mark and I have been doing with the Rio Chama along those lines. We can talk about that. We can get there. So that's one thing our group maybe has to offer as a something to the larger group, is to talk about shared experiences from the past. But what were other people's experiences? Did anyone else come up with a good cross-cutting conversation that people wanted to raise, or who wants to report back?
Well,
I'll report back from my group.
yeah, go ahead. She's going to talk about the same thing. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
So, our group wound up focusing on communication methods that can really make a project, an effort, even if it's not research, really transdisciplinary. And that's ways to reach people who aren't part of the research community. So first, Kathy brought up art, and that's a fabulous way to connect with people. And then I'm looking at Mark Stone. I brought up the story of the RC4 and the work that we did with pairing art and science in that effort, where we took the students who were doing research projects, paired them with an artist, and had them express the real meaning of the research that's being done by the student. And it was a tremendous success. And I hope we get to do that sort of thing again. But I sure felt that is a path towards transdisciplinary work. The other thing that we talked about is the role of acequias in sort of charting a path for governance around water in New Mexico, and what that means from the perspective of the non-research community, what we all can learn, the history of our own state and how our water systems were managed in the past, which is really different from the very top-down system that we use today. Did I capture it, Kathy?
That's great. Regarding the art, I completely agree. I've watched art really inform the issues related to big game migration in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem.
Sorry, you're breaking up, Mindy. Can you get a little closer to your microphone? Sorry.
Is this better?
So far.
The art really is very powerful. And I just put in the chat Nina Elder's work. She's doing work related to wildfire forest systems in the Sierra Nevada right now, but she's from Albuquerque. And she's interested in being involved in this project. She's working with communities. So she's got some very cool work that you can see. I'm a big and yeah, agreed on the acequia element as well. Other people to offer thoughts?
I'll just offer a few thoughts from our group, and unfortunately I'm going to have to leave in just 3 minutes. So, but quickly, we were talking about a little bit the issue of transdisciplinary work sometimes falling into the trap of trying to recreate community that already exists, and that there's a lot of community groups and collaboratives already out there in New Mexico working on these issues, where academics really just need to show up and be part of it versus trying to, invent a transdisciplinary model or communication model to somehow recreate community. So that was we were talking about some specific projects that are just questions that need to be answered, projects that need to be done, that to some extent, there's an important role just for matchmaking with academic resources and researchers.
Great. Will you please make sure that those get to Irene and myself, what you guys wrote down?
Yeah, Melanie, why don't you send them a list of projects that have to be done?
Melanie, your matchmaking. Yes, sounds great.
I have about 50 years of research and technical development that needs to be done across the state.
You and I need to chat. We're overdue for our own little chat. I need to talk to you about a bunch of stuff. But yes, we need to do matchmaking, lots and lots of matchmaking. That's one of the reasons I'm so excited about the Rio Grande Fund, because I feel like the Rio Grande Fund with its 84 signatures is already a very well organized, highly sophisticated, collaborative group that is already very well poised to be a group that we can enter into and ask what do you need? You know, what kinds of questions can we help answer for you about this watershed? You know, what's going, you know, how can we help, basically, you know, and start to inform the conversation with a co-creative model. So I feel like that's one of the reasons why I feel like that's a natural starting point, because it very much is grounded in partnerships, and also of many different kinds of levels, everyone from, you know, relatively, you know, from really sophisticated partners like Bureau of Reclamation to, you know, much more, you know, modest, you know, landowners, you know. So I think it's a kind of a built-in entry point that way.
I would actually say that it's probably the best model in the state currently for collaborative multi-sectoral conservation projects and research of any kind. And it's also the highest capacity. And what we need to do is replicate that model in the Middle Rio Grande for Middle Rio Grande projects, and replicate it for tribal projects. And we need to replicate it for all these different other sectors. So I would encourage this group to think about, are there areas where there's high need and not currently capacity?
Yeah. So the model itself is definitely something worth learning about. Other points?
I could weigh in for our group. We spent time talking about, I'm getting a strong echo. It's probably from you, Mindy. So we talked about the distinction between multidisciplinary versus transdisciplinary versus really mission-driven research. And I think the distinction between multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary, we all kind of got that. You can do multidisciplinary work and still be in what I'm trying to coin as our Adobe tower. We don't have any ivory at UNM. There's none. It's all Adobe. So, but in the Adobe tower, we can still do our multidisciplinary research without really thinking about stakeholders. And that the other perhaps extreme of that is those of us, especially in the engineering field, we do a lot of mission-driven research where the Interstate Stream Commission or the Environment Department or the Water Authority or whoever has a need, the Flood Control Authority, and then they'll ask us, can you do this project? It might be multidisciplinary, it might not be, but we do it. So that's very stakeholder driven. But that being different than convergent research where you're co-developing research priorities and co-conceiving the research and even co-engaging in the research. But in terms of capacity, another issue that came up was, well, then who funds that? Because that's not necessarily in the Water Utility Authority's mandate. That's not in the Flood Control Authority's mandate to make our society better through transdisciplinary work. And it's different than what NSF typically funds too, because they want it to be the next big step in a journal paper. So this is a different way of thinking about how we engage in research, and it goes back to capacity as well. That pointing out the CHAMA projects, we've been doing this great work on the CHAMA almost entirely on a volunteer basis, right? So I think that's something to think about, as if how could we move a program build a program, but also think about who's going to support that program, which probably ties back to some of Melanie's points of tying it to the state's interests and tying it to the interest of the philanthropy groups, et cetera. So that's kind of where we went.
Thank you so much. Super helpful. Who's next? Anyone want to offer?
Well, I know, so in the Water Fund, we have a lot of like really place-based collaboratives. And I would like to see this group not this group, but members from this group engage more with the place-based work that's going on. But I think if you do that, you have to be willing to make a commitment to that group, because you're going to have to build trust with the individual members. And if you do that, then you'll learn what the needs are over time, and you'll be able to develop a research question or a research package that addresses needs. But it's often not, it's often really applied science, and it's not NSF stuff all the time. It's sometimes fairly, general questions that can lead to synthesis kind of work and lead to bigger picture kind of stuff. But the grassroots engagement in tapping into the communities that already exist is an exercise in trust building. And so the volunteer work is going to be, part of it for a lot, for a while. And it's just like, it has to be built into the research program or the research project. And I think, identifying the scale at which you would like to work is going to help influence or inform the decision about which groups to engage with. And so the basin-wide scale is very different, and it involves a different set of people than working at the scale of like the Santa Fe watershed. But those are both places ripe for investigation and places ripe for collaboration. And there's people on this call and that I know have experience with that, but it's tough to sort of, sometimes it's tough to sort of think of like, what's the transdisciplinary team you want to put together without thinking about what's the cross-jurisdictional problem you're trying to solve. So it's a bit chicken and eggy, and maybe we need more eggs, or maybe we need more chickens. I don't know what the right thing is.
The panarchy problem. I love it.
And omelets, which are great too. But I have a bit of a reflection on that, because we've talked about in other settings how decisions around water are often made by people at the table, and people at the table are the people with the resources, because the people who have full-time jobs or other commitments can't be there. So there's a resources issue. And I don't know if we can write a paper on this, but I feel like, to Colin's point, I totally agree. That's what it takes, is that consistent investment of time. And those of us in the academic realm, we're time poor, right? That's the one thing, it's the one thing we don't have is time. So perhaps that's the specific chicken and egg, is how to develop the resources so that those investments can be made when it requires our thinnest resource.
Well, one thing, Mark, this is just a total idea, is I completely understand the time poor piece. But, you know, you've done a reasonably good job of recruiting, you know, especially graduate students, but undergraduate students as well from the local areas. And so if we could, like, maybe one thing we could work on specifically is figuring out how do we engage students at the high school level so that when they go into undergrad, they're part of those place-based collaboratives. They're your conduit. And so it's not volunteering time for them. It's actually just, you know, it's part of their learning, part of their educational development. And then, you know, undergrad thesis projects, master's projects, PhD stuff is all kind of like sort of spinning off of those things. And then they're already tied into that community. They've already got the, you know, the trust relationships and stuff started.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
And I think we could do that with, you know, there's an opportunity to engage with all the universities in New Mexico to do that, whether it's community colleges up through sort of the highest level PhD stuff.
Yeah, great. I'll follow up with you on that. That's great.
Great. You know, just this is totally random, but something that came up in another meeting I was in is that that I didn't know. Mary Jo's on the call, and she might know this. Is that apparently every university has to use a certain percentage of its work study in community engagement, like community, and it's like a large percentage, it's like 30% or something like that. The work study hours that it uses as a university. And it's like, and you know, that stuff is so cost effective. And I thought, well, holy moly, you know, we could like release, you know, dozens of undergraduates into the wild, you know, doing community engaged projects for pennies on the dollar, potentially with work study undergraduate type research, potentially. I'm thinking about that. So it's something I've been talking with Monica Colwell about a little bit.
Can I ask a quick question? Is anybody in this group working with the National Park Service with the trails committees? I see a connection between like the Camino Real, that part of the trails system, and the Rio Grande, because the Camino Real trail does follow along the Rio Grande. And so I was wondering, and they are trying to also save parts of the trail. And I'm thinking there might be a connection between this group and that group as far as looking at where the river's been and where it might be going.
Yeah, that could be a good partner. I haven't. I mean, I have worked with the Park Service in other contexts, but not this context. So that would be worth thinking about. All right, guys, this has been a really good discussion. I obviously lots of chickens, lots of eggs, lots of things we need to be putting more on paper. But you know what I think would be good is actually starting to maybe throw up some things on the Slack site, and maybe we need to start organizing ourselves a little bit in accordance with our expertise. Start doing a little bit along the lines of what Melanie is asking us to do in terms of like starting to think like, okay, who's potentially really bailing into this idea of a collaborative, and then how do we kind of start organizing ourselves in terms of our own eggs and what, you know, our own strengths and capacities. Start thinking about that element of it as we start thinking about you know, then sort of the questions that we could potentially take on in the watershed as well. So anyway, in 2 weeks we'll have more time to talk about this, and we'll be able to hit the ground a lot faster. The paper is actually, I think, a lot more engaging because it's a little more case study based, and I think it will hit closer to home as a case study. So Tati Steelman's currently the Dean of the Environmental Studies program at Duke University. She's a real rock star. So hopefully you'll enjoy that paper, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate you. Thank you again, and I'll talk to you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Cindy.